This is Season 2, Episode 10 of Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast all about upping your game. Doesn't matter if you're a game master or a player, you'll find advice, ideas, and some strong opinions. Tonight's episode, creating interesting fights in combat, or I am not left-handed. Once again, welcome to Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast. Like I said, we're going to about maximizing your game and giving you ideas and all sorts of good stuff like that. I'm Carl with my co-hosts Eric and James, and you can find information about the show at masteringtherpg.com. Send us some email, feedback, questions, suggestions, whatever, at gamemaster@masteringtherpg.com. Good to have you guys back on the mics. It seems like it's been forever, but it hasn't really been. So welcome. Good night or good day. How you guys doing?
Good morning. Yeah, I'm going great, Carl. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Been having a lot of fun with our games and everything. So how about you, Eric? How you been doing?
Yeah, I've been doing all right. Yeah, same thing. And we had some fun games and some fun stuff on the Tabletop Tango channel, too. We did an interesting live show with the publishers from Pinnacle, the people who make it, so that was cool.
Yeah, we had...
Congratulations. A big milestone. Congratulations.
Yeah, 150. Doesn't make sense.
150 episodes, and there would be a little more, but there's a couple that were unnumbered. And it was awesome that PEG is the guys who make the game. We had their marketing director, their creative director, some other folks, and gave them a quiz. Quizzed them on Savage Worlds, and they really didn't do as well as I thought they were going to do. I think I made the questions too hard. I did research.
Some of them were, yeah.
Yeah, some of them were probably way too hard. I didn't think they were, but they probably were. So,
were you like one of those Comic-Con panels where you've got obscure canon and lore that the actors have no idea what you're talking about? Was it kind of one of those experiences?
Yeah, it could have been a little bit like that. Some were pretty simple. Sure. Well, some were like mechanics.
Some were like rule based
that they should have been able to get. You know, it's like medium cover -4. I thought that was easy, but you know, if you're not thinking of it, it's easy to kind of get confused.
Hey, there's a lot of rules. Even for people who write the game, there's just a lot, right?
Yeah.
In all these games, nobody can. That just shows you that nobody can have like an encyclopedic knowledge. All right, nobody's perfect in that way. So
yeah. And they were just an absolute hoot. It was just so much fun hanging out with them.
And we got some like previews and like dates. We got some scoops, so that was cool.
Yeah, that was.
Anyway, congratulations! 150 episodes of anything is no mean feat. So well done, gentlemen. That's great news.
So what else? So James, you've had some interesting stuff going on. What's been? You mentioned a little bit of a tidbit when we were talking earlier.
I've had a weird week. I'm not going to lie. I'm having one of these strange weeks as a dungeon master. I'm running 6 games this week, and they're all bizarrely all in dungeons, which is an interesting way to spend your week. Spending a week, what is it? 17 hours in a 5 foot by 5 foot grid. I'm just kind of moving things methodically through a dungeon. And I must admit, I have a bit of a tragic story, and I feel should I feel guilty about this? I don't know. I don't deliberately try and kill my characters, but I had a player lose his 3rd character in the same campaign this week. They're only level 4. This poor guy lost his armorer artificer, which is like the most heavily armored thing I've ever seen. This guy's gone from a cleric with heavy armor to a paladin with heavy armor to an armorer artificer.
Okay,
because I think he's getting more and more annoyed that he dies all the time, and the poor bugger has just had a rough trot. So I had to console a player that lost his 3rd character. And
he always plays the tank, right? He wants that role, but it just keeps happening where he goes down.
He has turned into that. He started off as the group's healer, and then when he died, he went, well, that didn't work. I better put on some more armor, so I'll be a paladin so that I can be tougher and more armored. And then he died, and then now I'm really sick of being killed. So now I'm going to play a guy that builds his own Iron Man kind of armor suit, and then he died. And yeah, I feel bad. I feel bad, but it's one of those things, and perhaps we'll talk about this later on in the episode. It was one of those encounters where they were massively overpowered, like the enemies were overpowered to what they were. My thought is that they would recognise that the threat was massive, and they would flee. And they did not.
Yes. That's a lot to ask the player characters. Players, they don't like to run.
Yeah, that is the classic trap. We can talk about that. Because we might even do a separate episode about that or part of something else, because I don't know if we'll even get to that in this episode. But that is something that I've seen. And it's kind of like, because certain game masters might do that, and then you kind of learn, Like I had that in my new Pathfinder game I'm in. That's how the GM was. And he made these things. And because it's at first when you play so many games, you would expect that, the game master is matching these encounters to us, and you just expect that to be the reality. And even when they might hint at you, you might not just keep it up because you're I'm ready to go. I'm ready to use my abilities, right? We've been role playing for the last 2 hours. I'm ready to use my combat. So yeah, that goes over players' head a lot. So I think that will be an interesting discussion about how do you tell players, how do you make sure players know? And about that. So interesting. And
for me, it was about speeding things up. So these guys were just kind of taking their sweet ass time to kind of maneuver through a dungeon. And I'm like, we're done with this. I want to get you out of here. So I'm going to make you run out of the dungeon rather than just slowly 5 foot by 5 foot work your way out of the dungeon.
Yeah.
So I brought in what I thought was an obviously massive beast that was sharpening its claws on the walls of the dungeon and slammed into the barbarian and took him down half his hit points with one fell swoop, and then roared, and he was massive and regenerating and a scary thing. And they were like, we can take him, and they really couldn't. And I feel bad now. But
that's interesting.
What do you do?
I almost think that in those, this is not the topic, but I just had this thought because I remember when Carl was doing his Dragonlance game, and we were talking about fighting the dragon. And I remember when we were talking about, I was like, dramatic task, might use a dramatic task for it instead of a normal combat. I almost feel like for when you want to do that for a player, don't even do a normal combat. Do a skill check where it's not about fighting them. It's just okay, you're going to do this. It's just about surviving and getting away. That's the encounter. I think that's almost probably the better way to do it, because players will just want to fight because they think, we are the heroes of the story, right?
We can beat anything.
We have to explore this. I think we have to explore this more. But
perhaps another episode, but I digress. So a strange week. Yeah.
Okay.
Very cool. But how about you guys? How's the game's been panning out? How about to you, Carl?
The game's been doing pretty well. We had a couple of weeks off. We've had a hard time recently. There've been a lot of absences, but
scheduling.
They just got done saving a planet from annihilating themselves in a thermonuclear war, and they came down and we're like the aliens. Look, we're from space and we're aliens and we know better. You need to listen to us. And they did, because they did a good job convincing them, even though the bad guys knew what was going on, and there will be retribution from the forces at work now that that's happened. So, but I made a
concerted effort to fix their environmental problems, their impending environmental collapse. I made the concerted effort to here's what we'll do for you so you'll listen to us.
So zero prime directive for this group, is that right?
No. It's the opposite of prime directive. Because we even talk about that in the game. We're because this is the game that we played 2 or 3 games ago, and it's the same world but kind of sped up later on in the future. It's just a different philosophy. And so we actually talked about that. We would have no problem. It's the opposite. My character literally wants to bring things, a person back with him to be hey, look, this is what they're about. But yeah, they're the opposite. They want to interfere as much as possible. So,
yeah, they've literally taken an entire society already back to their home planet and looking at their skills and saying, yes, they can build stuff that we can't. Let's take advantage of that capability they have that we... Now I have
teach them how to build better weapons on their planet. Yeah, so it's been
a
lot of
very
cultural. Anyways,
no worries about that. How about your games, Eric? Have your stuff been going on?
That's pretty much it.
Okay, all right.
Keeping on.
My game is keeping them honest. Okay. So, hey, this week we actually have both an email and a cool stuff found all wrapped into a single package. It's like both. So I don't know which music I should use to introduce this, but it's both.
I think
we have cool stuff found. Do you copy? Cool stuff found. Over.
Cool stuff.
It's a cool stuff found, for sure.
Okay, it's a cool stuff. All right. So this is from Brent. He says, "Hi guys, I have listened to every episode of the podcast, and they've all been helpful and fun. Thank you all. Apropos your most recent episode on building cohesive groups, I recently found, but not yet used, an intriguing product that might help address many of the good points and tips you discussed called Backstory, and the product he's saying is called Backstory Cards by Ryan Macklin, and looks like the company's The Immaterial Plane. And he provides a link to Drive Through RPG to an actual Foundry module that has the game, this mini game in it. So it's essentially a mini game to define kind of relationships and backstory of the group as a whole. And so what's interesting is James found a copy of like a preview copy of this and was looking at it, and basically the card has kind of a tag, whether it's co-op, it's an adversarial relationship, or something along those lines. And then it has a prompt. Like, for example, one card says, you and a PC work to undermine or directly combat one of a group's, and you define that group's machinations. What did the conflict cost you? What did it cost the group? And so it's interesting that now you start answering those questions, and there's some prompts as to, which character or which player on the table you would be working with and discussing. So I don't know. What do you guys think of kind of a mini game with these questions that would kind of prompt sort of that fate type discussion?
It's a really interesting little set of cards and a really great little resource. We've talked a lot about Session Zero and about how, as a storyteller, you might present a world and then you invite your players to create backstories that might link into this world. And I think this product kind of ups the ante on this a little bit and really solidifies some of those concepts. So the idea is that you start with a list of what they call a setting grid, where you might put places and organizations and characters and bits and pieces as a storyteller into your setting grid. And then one by one, the players draw these cards to try and get connections both between their character and the setting, between the character and other characters, and characters and their adversaries. And it looks like a really interesting way to do it. I'm a very big fan of random tables to help kind of get the creative juices going. This thing takes it a much larger step forward. It's almost like having a bit of a game of Uno before you actually get started playing. And it looks like this would really be a big chunk of a Session Zero. I've only got the preview copy of this. I didn't actually purchase the full copy. So there's some great examples about how this might be used. And it'd be really interesting to see the full extent of the full gamut of cards. And it looks like they've done heaps of these. What's the name of the company? Brooklyn Indie Games have produced a whole heap of different expansions that you could use for a sci-fi game or a Wild West game and things like that to build the character's backstory. I'm all in favour for any product or anything that will help provide that cohesive gaming group, that helps to provide interconnections between characters in order to get that cohesiveness before you even start. It's not a bad little product, really. Eric, what do you think? Have you had a chance to have a look?
No, not really. I haven't, but it seems cool. I mean, I've seen some stuff like this. Yeah, it seems really cool. I mean, it's cool there's a full Foundry module, or you can get the PDFs. It does look like it's more leaning toward Fate Core. I guess that's kind of what they made it in mind, but it's generic, right? It can be used for anything. But they talk about how it directly integrates into the character creation for Fate and Fate Accelerated. I generally, I think these type of products are really good for like things like Fate or some Apocalypse Engine games, like shorter campaigns or like one shots, like, you know, quote unquote one shots, like a mini campaign. I think these things would be really good because you don't necessarily need to have everybody write their own backstories and see how they implement together. Like, you don't have time for that in those shorter games. So to me, the strength of this really seems like for shorter games like that. But yeah, I'd certainly be interested to give it a go and like try it as an experiment for like a mini campaign or a one shot. I think it'd be fun.
It's a good point. I think if for a longer campaign, if you were doing a longer narrative-driven campaign, this kind of surrenders the reins a little bit in that I'm not sure I'd be overly comfortable with that much randomness infiltrating kind of my background stories on how these characters work together. But if you want a quick and dirty kind of, let's get into this, how do our characters know each other, and provide you with some story prompts about how this might work, sure. I think it looks like a very fine product.
Yeah. And like shorter games was when I'm interested in playing like really different character types. So this could like force you into playing a character type that you would not normally want to play, right? So yeah,
there you go.
Seems really cool.
Well,
good call out from the listener.
Thank you, Brent. I appreciate that. It looks like if I read further, it's trying to use it coming up in a King Arthur Pendragon game, which should be interesting
awesome.
and fun. So that very cool, very cool. Again, thank you, Brent. Appreciate the email.
Pendragon, which is a Chaosium, I believe it's about to get a new reprint. Pendragon is as ancient as Avalon. It's a really old system. So I'll be really interested to see what they do with when they come up and redo it. So good one. I haven't thought of or played Pendragon in a long, long time, but I'm glad it's still trucking along.
I did find it in some old Dragon magazines when I was doing a search in them. So. All right, so hey, thanks again. So what do you say, gentlemen? Do we get right to the main topic?
Mastering the RPG with Connor, Eric, and James. Yeah.
All right, the main topic, as we know, is to create interesting fights, and I'm going to turn it over to Eric as master of ceremonies for tonight. Eric, take it away.
All right, so right at the outset, I think the first question to ask for this is why interesting fights? And this one is almost self-answering. Like, I don't even know if we need to answer it, but right? I mean, it's just more fun. I mean, you guys can disagree with me, but it's more interesting, right? You do the same fights over and over again, combat becomes very bland. And I think that's why when we look for this is like, how can we make things more interesting? Do you guys have anything else here, or?
Well, and the only thing I wanted to add was when we talk about interesting fights, it's people like to just fight. That's fine. But we're really talking about what makes it unique and an experience that people are going to kind of remember, and not just it was yet another slog to get to the end goal of getting through the dungeon, for example, or 6 dungeons as the case might be. So,
absolutely. Yeah. And this was the thing that when I was preparing for this episode, it's almost like what makes memorable fights, isn't it? Because, when I was thinking about what are the most interesting fights that I've been in this year or ever, it's really making them memorable. It's really making them stick in your player's mind. And it's that kind of, that was awesome. You really want these things to be quite extraordinary. And we have done an episode on boss fights and what makes a good boss fight. And I think a lot of what we said there is probably true here. But when you think about your normal role-playing game, you might have 1, 2, maybe even 3 encounters in a session. How do you make these interesting? How do you make them different from each other so that it isn't just kind of moving things around and slogging through a massive chunk of hit points? And how do you make it? And for me, it's about creating those memorable moments, the ones that, after the session you go, that was really, really brilliant. And those high-fiveable moments when players are playing, for sure.
And I think the thing with this is, but I think we're going to try to illustrate here is that it doesn't always have to be like you have to do a lot of work and make, even for random encounters, I think you can use a lot of the concepts that we're going to introduce, because it doesn't always have to be like the big boss, big scene, where you spend a lot of time meticulously adding this and that and that. No, I think there's a lot of little things that you can do that makes the fight seem different. That will be, more memorable, and also just you won't get that feeling of sameness, right? I think that's what we're trying to really avoid with it, is that kind of like, oh, here's another one of the same, like, just pushing. Like, do we even need a map? Like, we'll just use a grid and like not have anything there, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
cool.
and you're right, and out of all the big lists of suggestions that we might be going through here today, you can really grab one or two of these just to spice that encounter up, just enough to give it a little bit more interesting than your normal kind of slog, for sure.
Yeah. And then, I mean, this leads right into the next question of when do you do interesting combat? And I think we're pretty much already answered that. It feels like, almost
Always.
every time. I mean, really,
Sure.
Because like we're saying, we think that you don't have to do this complicated thing, right, Carl? Like,
No, it doesn't have to be. Fights can be interesting. Every fight can be interesting. If it's not interesting, maybe you shouldn't even have the fight, right? If it's just the kill time, so to speak, maybe you shouldn't even have the fight. So every fight should be interesting in its own right. It doesn't have to just be a set piece.
yes.
Right.
Yes, exactly. Cool. So let's move on to the really meat of this, because that's what this is all about. And this is where we break down the kind of components of what makes an interesting fight, what makes a more memorable fight. And really here, we're breaking this down into 4 distinct sections. And like what James said before, is when you kind of just pick one or two. And then, again, this depends on like how much does this combat mean? How much work do you want to put in? And so I think for just a random encounter, you might put just like 1 or 2 of these things in. For something that's more notable, you put 3 or 4. And then for like a boss fight, you might go with 5 or 6 of these, just to really like change it up. So the main components here is what we're talking about is the map, which is kind of the general environment. That's the cup, right, that the things are going into. The enemies, that's the obvious, right? They have to have, because it's a combat, so you need your enemies. The third thing here is we're going to talk about is the victory loss conditions, which I think this gets overlooked the most out of any of the other ones. And we'll talk about that. And then finally, the narrative. How do we add narrative elements? So let's start with the map. Let's talk about some of these individual components. James, what is 1 or 2 that you can think of like map things that you can add to a map to spice up a combat?
Well, the trick is look, mapping is huge, and I think we should probably do another episode on mapping as well. In the advent of virtual tabletops, maps I find are far more prevalent than when we used to just gather around a table and pour out on a grid and just kind of mark it all up or use your minis and terrain. But for me, the big 3 are terrain, weather, and obstacles, and really creating interesting places with which to fight. I'll start with the terrain, if we like, which is changes of elevation and just generally the field of play, and making maps interesting by creating changes and differences in the way that in the place in which you fight. That could be a ravine, which then kind of limits the amount of close infighting that you could have. It could be a small constrained area, so it constrains the amount of range combat that you might have. It could be submerged, half in water. It could be shrouded by fog. It could be all sorts of things. But creating something in that element that changes up and restricts how you can approach a combat, can approach an encounter, which then allows players to have to think creatively about how to overcome that terrain to be able to kind of adapt to it in order to work as well as you can. A really good example, even last night, I had a combat that took place in knee-deep water. Now, it's not much, it was something a little bit. It just slowed everyone down a little bit. But it did allow people to duck under the water when a fireball went off. It did allow people to kind of, grab some water and throw it into someone's face to distract them. It just gives an element to a combat that changes it, makes it slightly different.
Yeah, and I think... Again, when we're talking about map, like you don't have to be this excellent map maker. You don't have to be adding graphics. This can just be squiggles on things. Like you have a map already. And so like you were talking about, for me, the environmental hazards is huge here, where, you have a map that you already have, on your computer or whatever. And you just say, okay, because of what happened before, the forest is on fire. So you just add squiggly lines on trees and be like, this is where fires are, right? And so just even that, which doesn't take much effort, you're producing something that's really creating a hindrance for both you and the enemies, and something like you said that they have to get around. And so this can be tons of things, right? Like fire on trees. This can be like you said, weather effects like wind, or like elevation, like you said, or there's just so many things here. So always just think of creative little bits to put in that can do that. So Carl, what are some other thoughts here that you have?
Well, I think you guys pretty much hit the big ones, but I don't know if it really came through that the dynamics of the having a dynamic environment. You mentioned like the trees are on fire, but things that change over time. So it's, for example, there's a lava flow that's eating away parts of where the players are standing. So they have to make a decision on changing their tactics in the middle of combat, or there's a flood or something because they're no longer the tactics they came in. Like for example, they're in the water, right? And they're deciding I'm going to duck underneath it for a fireball. Well, what happens now if that water is getting deeper and deeper? They have to change those tactics over time. And I think making the environment dynamic is another way to make it interesting. Make sure it also feels 3D. I think you mentioned that a little bit. It's easy when you're talking about maps, on the table surface, that they're really two-dimensional representations of the world. If you can make it feel 3D, and I think, James, you talked about it, that, there's a cavern maybe there's on the side of a hill, and they're looking down. The archers are looking down on the player characters. What are they going to do about that? Are there environmental things that they can now work within to protect themselves from that elevation? But just make the environment feel like it's a real environment if it possibly can. And that's really tough because, again, maps are two-dimensional. Even with the animated maps you can get, and I'm a big fan. I'm an old school, so squiggly lines on grid paper is great because it's supposed to be your imagination anyway, right? So I'm not worried about it. But today there's so many resources that have like animated maps, but I still look at them and they're still not 3D. They're still just this two-dimensional representation of the world. So if you can make it feel 3D, great. Make the environments dynamic. That adds also a little flavor, I think, and makes the players think about tactics as they go through the encounter over time.
Another one I wanted to bring up here. Oh, sorry, James. Did you want to say something?
One of my favorites is elevation. I love elevation.
Me too.
Things that are 4 stories above the earth, pits, crevices, things that you can hurl people into is one of my favorite parts of it. And the risk of being hurled that keeps players on their toes. If you've got a massive hill giant that's just picking up people and throwing them off a cliff, you certainly raise the tempo and raise the fear really, really well with that one. But sorry, Eric, I interrupted.
No, it's totally good because that on that, and it really creates, I find, like, it interrupts with the movement in interesting ways when you have different elevation in different places, because you have to climb, or this is whatever it's called, like slow terrain or whatever. So it really kind of mixes, like, where here's where people can move their full movement, here's where they're interrupted, and either the enemies or the players can kind of use that to your advantage. And it really does. And just switching even map to map where those things are can even give the full map like a different experience. The other thing that I wanted to touch on here is, which I think is underutilized at point, is messing with scale and using choke points. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about with elevation, but when I talk about scale is, when we're talking about going from combat to combat and maybe doing something just minor things, one of the things that you can do is sometimes have a giant map, because that also will, the players have to get to them, right? Or having a tiny map where they don't have room to really move about and properly have their stuff and have people flee, or have a mix of that where you have like one section is very wide open and one section is very constrained. So you can definitely mess with scale. And then choke points come into that too. Like you said, like a bridge, right? We're talking about elevation, having a bridge, having some type of choke points there, or like a small part of the ravine. Those things can really offer interesting challenges or interesting things for them to capitalize on. And again, you can mess with a map and say that, like, say, okay, like we have a map that I found off the internet and there's this open area, but you're like, okay, rocks fell here. So there's this, there's only this small narrow passage here. And you can just use the pen function on whatever Foundry or whatever VTT you're using and kind of squiggle in things there and just say they're rocks, So like we're saying, we don't know what to do all this effort. So anything else, James or Carl, here that...
And your adversaries can change the terrain. Don't forget this,
Yeah.
and it could be as simple as a gust of wind that a wizard might do to extinguish all the lights so that suddenly it all goes dark. Or there's a gas that spreads across the battlefield. Or there's a acid that comes out of a boss and cuts out half the terrain, because if you stand in it you'll take damage. It's creating terrain and creating obstacles that are dynamic, so that even if you set up what it looks like a very straightforward map and a very straightforward battlefield, doing things that change that and alter it, so that players have to adapt and have to move.
Yeah, I think because we talked about this in the boss fight, and D&D does this very well. Is with when we talk about layers, and this is going to combine with the enemies part. It's very cohesive, obviously, but yeah, having layer effects, which are kind of themed to whatever enemy they're facing, right? And I think you touched on that. Like if you're facing off with an acid dragon or whatever they are, right? There's going to be acid pools around. Or every once in a while, like geysers shoot up because they have powers. It's an earth elemental or something, or it's an earth witch, right? So having those layer effects are the kind of final. And this can be weird stuff too, right? This would have to conform to the natural environment. This can be something like there's it's an arcane lich, and so every once in a while, like magical distortions happen and everybody's shifted around, right? You have your front and the back, but every couple rounds, they switch places because there's like weird temporal stuff happening because of whatever they're facing. So I think layer effects is another cool thing. Carl, do you have any final thoughts here?
No, I think that's we hit some of the major points. It's just get creative with what you do and with the map. It doesn't have to be simple.
Yeah.
It can be make the map interesting is what it just comes down to. It's a piece.
And don't be afraid to squiggle, right? Don't be afraid to squiggle.
Yeah.
And we might talk a little bit more about the actual creatures themselves, but some maps favour some creatures, and so one thing that I always try and do is factor in what if a creature has lived here for a long time, how might they have altered the landscape to give them the extra advantage? And we talk a little bit about, if you think about cover or traps or, you can do all sorts of things with a map to kind of personalize it to the creatures that are living there, that you can personalize to the adversary that you're fighting to make it very unique to that encounter.
Excellent point. And that's a very good segue into our next section of enemies. So Leah, let's talk about enemies, and I think we should break this down into mooks and bosses elites, because there's a difference here. So let's start with mooks. Carl, I know you're a big fan of mooks. You love using mooks. What are some things that you do to spice up your mooks?
Well, so in Savage Worlds we have extras and mooks, and they're by definition not as powerful as the player characters, and you can kind of cut through waves of them. So the most important thing is do that. Have them come in waves. Keep them moving. Don't have them kind of come as one big batch. That makes it easy for the players to just rip through them. It's not interesting. It's like I use my 12 attacks that I have every round, and I just keep cutting them down, and it's not interesting. It's much more interesting if they're coming and you feel yourself, you're using your resources, and then, oh, wait, there's more of them. And then have them keep moving. They're not just coming and standing still. They're trying to use the environment to surround the players or to get into the most advantage or a position that's most advantageous to them, that they can really cause havoc. And I find that I think you guys in the game, you remember some of those guys, some of the mooks who do some of the damage that it's like, wow, that guy just did something that he shouldn't have done. He's like a nobody, but he was smart and kind of was part of a wave, and they weren't just standing there. They were like real opponents. Make the mooks a real opponent and not just window dressing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And when we're talking about mooks, often, if you're in a type of game that has a prevalent enemy, right? If you're in an undead heavy game, say, and you're fighting a lot of zombies, like this is where we're talking about where you can give them different special abilities and give them different themes. Like there's no saying that you can't have a acid zombie, right? So like when we're talking about before about you're doing a random encounter. How do you spice it up? It's like, well, if you already have the zombie spat block, like just add in acid immunity and give them an acid like ball that they can shoot out of their mouth, right? With pretty like 3d6 or whatever, like just a very quick kind of theme on them or one of them, right? And this goes back to we've talked about a lot of I'm spacing out here, like defying expectations or subverting expectations, right?
Yeah.
Where like if they're used to fighting zombies and like have a special, like have one of your special zombies and be like, oh, this one's been like experimented on and he's resistant to celestial, whatever, you know, your game is celestial damage and actually heals from it, right? Or whatever. Like there's no, you can put those little things in there to like really disrupt the normal flow of play.
Right. And
I know also, James, you have, Carl, you want to
well, I
talk
was just going to say,
this?
and they're still not the big bad, but they add spice to life. You know, they're spicy mooks, right? They're still not the just because they got some
mooks,
like jalapeno flavored mooks.
Yeah. It's a limited edition mook of we add pineapple to one or whatever. Yeah, James, go on.
I love mooks. I think they're amazing things, and there's two reasons that I think they're really great for creating really interesting encounters, and there's a couple of games that I use that are very mook-centric. Call of Cthulhu Pulp, Call of Cthulhu uses mooks, and they come up with the rule that mooks literally are one-shot death creatures, so that you don't have to whittle through a lot of hit points. You know, if you hit them, they're going to go, but you've wasted, or not wasted, but you've used your action to try and get rid of mooks. So in high fantasy games and in modern games, mooks are great for highlighting your wonderful powers. You know, it lets you let off that fireball that destroys 30 guys in one hit, makes a player feel like completely heroic. It creates a really memorable kind of explosion, or that time that your hero throws that stick of dynamite and takes out 5 guys, or blows up a car and does this kind of thing. So it allows for heroic, big scale stuff without necessarily kind of completely ruining an encounter, destroying a boss, you know, kind of affecting the narration. So it allows for the big explosive type of thing. The other thing I love mooks about, and you talked about this is the idea of waves, where you present half a dozen kind of creatures coming at you in waves. The reason why I love that, it's one of the very few dials a storyteller can make mid-combat after you've landed some enemies on the board, where you can either scale up an encounter or scale down an encounter if it's getting overwhelming. So when I run mook level encounters where you might send 8 guys up and then they all get destroyed in the first round, well, that's fine. I'll send 12 in next time, and then now they're struggling. So you can kind of ease off and ease on depending on how the players are going, and just to keep that difficulty level maintained and the excitement where you need to.
The mook spigot, we could call it.
Yeah, that's right.
Very cool. And another little trick here, I think that's an easy way to spice something up is you can add in another enemy who's not allied with the enemy that you're facing, like a random beast, right? Like you're fighting zombies, and all of a sudden there's a giant worm that shows up, and then all of a sudden they're fighting that, and they're fighting each other. You know, there's things you can play with. I think here, let's really talk about this. I think this is a very interesting subject that could almost have its own video. But let's talk about tactics and intelligence, because there's that old adage, right, in games where about like you can play them smart or you can play them hard. I think, right? Like, because if you play them smart, you don't want to have as high as CR, and you don't want to have as many on the board. And if you're playing them stupid, you might be able to have stronger ones that are just kind of, not necessarily thinking about going for the healer. So I think when we'll talk more about this, I think you guys have a lot of thoughts on this, but I think this is important to switch that up. Is to not every combat have smart types and not every combat have dumb types. If you kind of flip-flop between those, it will, seem more fresh for the players. Carl, what are your thoughts on tactics and troop intelligence, that kind of thing?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that you have some that are, they're using good tactic and some that aren't. I think, the important part is that the opponents, I like to think the opponents should be using the tactics that make sense for them. I mean, they're going to use things like cover. They're going to use Things like if they're faster and they have the ability to move quicker, they're going to move quicker and try to flank and do things like that. And I think that makes it more interesting to the players in general because, they're not fighting a mindless drone. Because again, we don't want just, throw waves and waves at people just to throw waves and waves. It wants to be an interesting combat. So I really feel that, having them use the tactics that make sense for them. Now, some of them are like you said, they're hard and they're just not smart in the way they do things. And they're going to be like a tank and they're just going to walk and absorb damage and try to get as close as they can, as fast as they can without being smart. And that's fine because that's using the tactics that make sense for that particular enemy or group of enemies. And that's what I think helps make them feel a little unique because they each act in a certain way. Like your zombie that spits acid, they're going to use different tactics than the ones who are just kind of meandering towards the players, and they're going to expect that, right? Your players are going to expect that that's something more interesting and unique about that enemy and the feel of it.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if we're disagreeing here, but I almost feel like I have to push back. But I don't think I am. I think we're kind of in line. But I guess what I was more thinking is that, like, in a combat where you have basically another adventuring party, right? You don't want to have too many of those people because they're going to be playing very smart, using a lot of different abilities to the maximum efficiency, right? And that would be a very interesting combat to do that. And then in maybe another fight, so then that one you might have 4 or 5 enemies that they're facing off against, or 6, right? And then another fight you have a horde of mutated wildebeests, and maybe you have 15 of those, right? And they're real dumb. But you can have more of them because they're not just going to like try to use special abilities and like, try to get behind cover. And they're much tougher than the adventuring party. But so you can have more of them, right? Because they're so stupid. No, and I guess that was my point of kind of playing with that.
And we are on the same page because when I talked about the tactics that make sense. So if you have wildebeests that are big dumb, the players expect them to maybe charge as a large group coming at them, and now the players have to think about what are they going to do. They need to find that 3D level of getting out of it, but that made sense. That makes sense. It doesn't make as much sense if these things are sneaking around and trying to get into position to attack, right? I mean, that's all I was saying, and I think we're in violent agreement. Yeah, for sure.
We're definitely agreeing with that. I think I just meant that, like, you can have, this is something that maybe not even appropriate to this conversation, but that you can have more enemies that are dumb or stronger enemies that are dumb, right? Like intelligence, playing with that, it makes them stronger, I think, right? I think that's also the point I was making.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I'm with you.
Anyways. Okay, cool. Yeah. I think we're... James, what is your thoughts on all of this?
I love monster tactics. I think, to be honest, I would say that this is the thing that keeps me most interested in combat. For someone who runs probably a dozen combats a week, I find getting into the mindset of the monster or the creature, looking at their intelligence score, looking at their perceptions, looking at their array of abilities and trying to think logically about how that thing would act in combat, I find really creative and really wonderful. And look, I've talked about this in Cool Stuff Found before. Keith Ammon, The Monsters Know What They're Doing, which is a Dungeons & Dragons focused tactic book for Dungeon Master, was an absolute game changer for me in terms of looking at every ability of a monster and trying to figure out how that would turn into a tactical situation and trying to think cleverly about how you would use that, which takes into account that the dumb, lumbering, kind of Umber Hulk that doesn't have much intelligence, it just kind of slams into you. It deals with that. But it also deals with the clever little kobolds that might set a trap and might do other little bits and pieces. So there are resources out there that help you on this. If you find yourself, struggling with how different adversaries will react under different situations, there's certainly ways that you can deal with it. Another quick plug that might lead us into the next topic as well is he has just released a book about 3 months ago called How to Defend Your Lair, which is a fantastic little source book for more boss stuff about how would you actually set up a lair to defend it, which for me is a great reading for anyone who wants to create a dungeon from scratch and try and work out how these things would make a lot of sense. But tactics are great. I'll never forget a time where I almost TPK'd a group, not deliberately, but because a group of goblins use doors so well. They literally opened a door, shot an arrow, closed a door, which meant that the players had to somehow deal with getting to a door, opening it, trying to figure out what was going through it. Meanwhile, another door on the other side of the room is being opened and they're shooting and closing a door. Just goblins using doors and cover changed the way that entire thing happened, as opposed to goblins running out with a spear and just trying to stab people to death. If you can think logically and think intelligently on behalf of your monsters, encounters are not only cool for the player and make it more challenging, they're actually really good fun to run as a dungeon master. And I mean, half of this is about running encounters that you're enjoying playing from the other side of the screen as well.
Yeah, and I think, and then one other thing I want to touch on here is I think we've talked about a little bit, is the troop composition. And that's, where you just don't have all melee fighters, right? You have some range fighters, you have a support, or you have like a large beast that they've tamed or something. Just having the different things with different abilities will also challenge. And the final thing that I think will lead really into the next one, because we talked about special abilities, is boss theme modifiers is what I called it, but basically theming mooks to a boss, right? This is, I kind of almost think of Batman villains and like their henchmen, right? If we think of like super villains, is that when like, you're fighting these zombies, but then you're fighting this weird lich who like says, I don't know, has a candy obsession or whatever. And then so you're fighting like, zombies that have candy armor on and can like, manipulate people to have like do will saves or want to like eat candy canes. I don't know. I just threw that in my mind, but like you can spice up mooks by like having them really themed to a boss, right? And I think that really goes into, let's talk about boss/elites. James, what are some things for you for bosses that you like to add or elites, right? It's not always a boss. Sometimes there's an elite.
Or multiple elites. So that's I love diversity of stat blocks and subtly changing stat blocks for to show differences in monsters and how that then plays out in a combat. So a great example, if you've got say gnolls, these kind of hyena-like creatures, you might have a shaman, you might have a champion, and you might have some kind of assassin within that group, the kind of rogue within the group. And so presenting different stat blocks for different monsters are a really good way of spicing up an encounter and making it less kind of same, that everything is all the same. And then for a boss, you really up that even more. You they need to be a little bit more robust, because the biggest thing that will happen when you drop a boss of any kind on the table is everyone looks at it and everyone channels all their energy into that boss. And there's good reasons for doing that. And narratively, we might talk about this later, because there'll be plenty of monsters that will give up and flee once the boss goes down. So creating a boss persona within a fight, really, really great. And it doesn't have to be the big end of campaign boss. It doesn't even have to be the end of level boss. But someone that is dictating the enemy's, coordinating the enemy's attack and is obviously in charge, creates a red flag so that it gives the players someone to aim at, but it also often these stat blocks for bosses have morale inducing or increasing or abilities to coordinate and using those abilities to kind of create a little bit of spice about how these encounters go. I see plenty of stat blocks in Dungeons and Dragons where, as an action or as a bonus action or as an extra ability, the boss can rally the troops and let them move or attack when it's not their turn or deal with that. And in a similar vein, Pulp Cthulhu has a really great ability that says, that's kind of like, get in front of me as an ability.
Yeah,
so
Salvador has that too.
If the boss is about to get hit, he grabs one of these mooks to take the hit for him. That kind of allows the extra the combat to continue.
Yeah, so I think Savage Worlds is called Fanatical Minions, Carl. It's like a setting rule.
Yeah, something like that. Yep.
Yeah. So having those kind of things that allow the whole encounter to change quickly because there is someone coordinating the fight. Really great thing to add spice to an encounter.
Carl, what about you?
Well, so I think what's interesting is the stat block side of it, having those unique characteristics, having the boss with something unique about them. Now, I mean, D&D, obviously, the stat block, they always have something unique. I think the key point is it's not just more hit points. To make a fight more interesting is not just to increase the hit points of the boss so that it's a harder struggle to complete, because harder does not necessarily equate to more interesting, which is what we're all about talking about. It's much more fun if the boss, and this ties all together what you were saying, right? You've got the Iceman, the Candyman, and you have the stat blocks that have unique characteristics, and it all kind of plays together to make the boss got a unique set of characteristics that make them a boss in the first place. Because interesting capabilities, interesting theming, like you mentioned, Eric, just not more hit points for the sake of having more hit points. But otherwise, I think, James, you're hitting on some of the real keys there for sure.
And I think here, let's talk about lair actions, or just lair, like how you fit them into the lair, because we talk about lairs a lot. And then one of the things I think about is like how do you tie them into the environment? Like you can give them, and when we talk about bosses, I'm also talking about elites, and this is maybe an elite that the players fought before. But this elite, like we said, like James was saying, has a different special ability, and you can really tie that into the map. Just to bring it back to the last one. So I may bring up like the Savage Worlds game that I ran you guys through, the Agents of WoW, and then you guys were fighting the Rat Tyrant, and he had regeneration. That literally was like rats coming from tunnels back into him. And Carl like quickly figured this out. You had to like shut those tunnels off to like end his regeneration. So I added that regeneration and was like, oh, he's like a bunch of rat, this big rat monstrosity. So yeah, it's a bunch of rats coming in. And like, so I kind of used the theming of the environment. Like I said that in the narrative. And that was like a cool ability that added some spice to it. And I think, James, you must have a lot of ideas about layers, right? And that kind of thing.
Again, yeah, layers are huge. And if I think of some of the fights that I put you through with hag layers, for example, using lots of different terrain-inducing hideous stuff that happens. Again, look, I don't get this stuff from a void. There's some fantastic guidebooks out there. There's an ENnie award-winning one called Home Field Advantage, which is a full compendium of lair ideas for various different, again, Dungeons and Dragons focus, but any fantasy game could pick it up, which talk about what are some of the layers that you can find yourself, and what are some of the things that might change. And they're as simple as kind of having a noble, having servants run in to assist, or guards run in to assist because they're kind of the rich noble lord, or very site-specific stuff. But for me, layers, there's a couple of things that happen with layers. The first one is you can create a mood, so you get a bit of a sense of place about what's happening here. And then you allow, again, that terrain to work for you. So it's the vines coming out of the walls and to help protect the plant boss, or it's the aboleth, which is like an underwater creature, with clouds of euphoric gas that might change people's minds. It's doing all of these things all at once by creating a cohesive lair that meets the theme with the boss, that also meets the theme with the mooks, that also meets the theme with the terrain, and it kind of, a lair will bind it all together to make it logical and make it interesting and make it fun.
Carl, any thoughts on this or any other ones?
I think it's brilliant. James just said it was brilliant. The environment, the map, the environment, and the enemies all should be symbiotic. They all work together as one unit, and there's a reason they're in that lair, and there's a reason that they put traps and they put things in there, and they have places for their mooks. So yeah, that's brilliant. Good thought.
Because you kind of want consistency and predictability in some ways, don't you? Like that if you're hitting the zombies that have got acid in them, and you're seeing pools of acid all over the place, when you meet the boss, you're expecting acid. So you're kind of setting it up so that you're creating these mini worlds that are logical and that extend on themselves, so that it becomes more unique and interesting the further you descend into the lair of the beast.
And of course, and we're not always talking about bosses here. Like we this could even be in a random encounter where you have the one kind of mini boss or elite that adds some flavor to it. One of the things that I like to do here, and this is another quick hack, because I think we need to talk about ones where you plan and ones where you have a quick thing that you can just throw in, is you can give an elite or even a boss like a magical item that might really change what they do, like a stronger magic item. And that's something that's easy to do, right? You just kind of throw at it like, a whatever helm of teleportation, and then you have it teleporting around the map, where normally it wouldn't be able to do that. And that's something that maybe then the players can pick up, or they can, maybe it's broken at the end, but they can kind of get money out of it, or a minor ability from that. Like maybe it doesn't
limited
completely
charges
work for them. Yeah, like exactly. Yeah. You don't have to give them the full thing, but you can give them a reward that was based on this. Like, we fought a bloater. They call them bloaters. They're like bloated zombies. We fought one of these before. They're really tough. This one was teleporting around. How is that possible? And then they found like a wedged magical item into its neck that allowed it to teleport. Also, you can make your own. Sorry, you go on.
I love potions for this very reason.
Yeah, I was going to bring up consumables.
You get an ability, but you don't give the item to the group after they kill the guy. So they can chug a potion of flying, and suddenly you got a flying zombie for some bizarre reason, spewing acid. Because why not?
No, that's an excellent point. I was going to bring that up. And you can still reward them. So this is something I think about in my Fallout game that I ran. I had these just kind of normal people that stole from the party, and they were kind of trying to get revenge. And I added this thing in where I was like, okay, I thought of this like weird grenade that is basically puts out pheromones, and I had just made a quick chart of like rad scorpions and mole rats, and the players would then roll on a d4, and like the enemies would throw this grenade, and it would summon either rad scorpions or mole rats in like a variable map. Like I just had them rolling die, and this added like a super chaotic element that really like changed up. It was a really unique fight that like, and then later on I was like, yeah, you guys can learn this recipe and then make these. They're not like easy to make. But I kind of gave that to them as a reward, so they could, themselves have this ability, and it was a lot of fun because it was just very chaotic, and it added like a second element to it, So yeah, playing with consumables and just kind of throwing wrenches in by giving them special items, because I think items are a way to give a weird ability to something that kind of counter to what you said, James. That isn't the most cohesive thing, right? Because the kind of big dumb tank that's able to teleport, like that doesn't make sense. Like how do they know teleportation magic? Oh, but they swallowed a potion, or they just happened to have this weird crown that allowed them to do it. So yeah, any other thoughts on kind of elites here?
The consistency of how I play compared to the chaos of how you play.
I just mean that you can mix it up, right? Because
yeah, sure.
Part of the thing we're talking about interesting combat is that that the combats that you're doing, they kind of will feel different, right? So you could have your really cohesive fights, and then this other combat has a chaotic element to it because, it doesn't have to make sense. Like they just found this item, but it makes the combat itself very different. I think that's the kind of point that I was making.
Absolutely.
Any other thoughts here on elites, Carl or James?
No, I think good coverage. Okay.
So let's move on to the third kind of topic here, or whatever, third component. Yeah. And this one, like I said before at the top, I think this one gets overlooked the most. And I think this one is almost by far the easiest to add an element to the combat, like a different element. And this is what we're going to talk about is victory loss conditions. So Carl, when I'm talking about this, what do you think of when I talk about this? Explain this to our audience.
Well, so when I hear like a victory loss condition, usually when we're talking about fights, there's only one that people talk about. We're killing everything on the field. Nothing can get away. We're going to slaughter all. And that's the victory condition. What we're talking about is kind of throwing monkey wrenches into that a little bit and changing up. Like, for example, I think just even a time element just to start with as a thought. There's a limited time to do what you need to do, or there's something that's forcing you need to get through this in a certain amount of time so that you can stop something else. And so it's not about killing everything. It's about killing enough or neutralizing enough so that you can continue on your way and keep moving. So it changes the goal. And that's just one example. I think we'll be talking, everybody will have their own examples, but that's just, the idea is it's not just kill everything. There's a goal specific in mind that we're trying to accomplish that defines victory for you.
Yeah, well, let's talk about time a little bit, because I think we can even expand on that, because it both goes toward victory and loss. I think you illustrated really, and you talked about this before with like a flood, right? That's a time element. But like I think we talked about like maybe like a heist, or there's a bomb going off. But I think you made a really good point about you have to do this. You have to kill a certain amount or get to a certain place by a certain amount of time. And this can also go the other way. Like The thing could also be like, you have to keep or distract the enemy for at least 8 rounds, right? And if like a certain amount get like behind you, then you've lost basically. So the victory there is like keeping the certain amount of the enemies at bay for 8 rounds or whatever. So it's not about all killing. James, let's talk. Why don't you throw one at the board?
Yeah, look, I think there should always be. There's never one way to skin a cat. You know what I mean? I think there should always be a secondary objective or something else on the board that allows you to short circuit the encounter in some way. I quite enjoy the Indiana Jones kind of trope of, you've got the flashy dervish wielding the swords and he pulls out the gun and then cuts the encounter down into 2. Having something that allows you to short circuit an encounter is also fantastic in terms of a memorable encounter that doesn't necessarily descend into what Carl was talking about, which is a 2 sides slog at each other until one has basically used up all the hit points of the other one. Really, it's having a secondary loss condition that the monsters will withdraw once they've burned down the barn. So that if you can stop them enough so that the barn doesn't burn, or if you can extinguish the fire in the barn, then the monsters go, okay, we're not going to win this. We withdraw, so that you don't have to kind of slog yourself all the way through there. So having some element within an encounter that lets you do something a little bit different, and it could be as simple as convincing the boss to call off the attack or something like that. Having a different win-loss condition than just slogging it out, I think is very, very important. Having this secondary objective hanging over you in order to kind of deal with the combat. Yeah.
It's very, very well put. And another one here I think that I like that I've used before is like a rescue or protect mission. And I think we can really draw from certain video game design, especially like tactical role-playing games. I mean, I don't think you guys play that much, but those often have a lot of these kind of things, just, again, to spice up fights. And one of those, to me, is rescue protect, where, the goal is, again, not to kill everybody, it's to rescue a certain creature. And I can think of, just James going to Feywild, we had one where we had to rescue a child. I remember that one from the Fey. And that was a really cool thing where we had some combat, but we had to kind of think, we had to use our powers in a different way, or it's to protect something. I mean, even like me and Carl did on our Tabletop Tango, we did a chase example, and it wasn't just us getting away; it was actually us protecting this VIP, just as part of the scenario. So I think, rescuing, protecting is a really easy way of just having that, like a person or an object, or like you said, like it's protecting a barn, or maybe it's a shrine, right? You have to protect the shrine, and you can combine these. You have to protect the shrine with for at least 8 rounds for the demigod to be summoned to the area or whatever.
Adding civilians or adding non-combatants to any encounter changes things dramatically. I love having fights erupt in the middle of a town square during an important event, just because it's not just killing the bad guys; it's making sure the bad guys don't kill innocent people in the interim. It makes a very, very different combat.
And it can be very crazy, and you may not even know who the combatants are and who aren't the combatants, and you have to think about it, right? So now the players have to bring some intelligence and tactics of the. It now goes back to tactics of the bad guys pretending to be regular folks can be a big part of that. So it just keeps rolling back to all these elements kind of clicking together. And one of the things that also is interesting is if there's something you want from this encounter. We talked about protecting a barn, but what if one of these people have something you need and you're trying to get it? All you really need to do is find that one individual, and you're trying to get what you need without having to kill everything, or without having to. You're trying to minimize the threat so that you can get what's special. And that's another victory condition that you can take advantage of, I think.
Yeah, that's important, isn't it? You need to understand what both the goal of the enemy is and what the goal of the players are in a lot of these encounters. And the goal does not have to be annihilation. The goal can be something very different, and just kind of making that very plain to a group so that they can focus in on that goal rather than just trying to kill everybody. Last night we did an assassination plot where the goal was not to kill everyone in the court. The goal was just to kill the king. And it was fantastic. It was subtle and it was little, and they had to do it very stealthily, and they had to kind of deal with that encounter. Had that devolved into a we are killing everyone in the courtroom, would have been a very different encounter, and to be fair, probably quite boring. It would have been, kind of guards against PCs for 3 or 4 hours. Instead, it was a fun little 20-minute great little expose where they ended up assassinating the king. Fantastic kind of encounter.
Very cool.
And then they burned the castle down, right?
Because they're murder hobos. Carl, going back to what you were saying, I wanted to bring up just a fight that we had recently in your game that really illustrated that well. It was that the one where we were on a ship and the crewmates were basically brainwashed. And we quickly figured out we had to destroy certain enemies. Like each enemy we destroyed might have been the ones brainwashing those crewmates. So we really had to ignore the crewmates or try to lock them down while we destroyed the kind of robots that were brainwashing them, hypnotizing them. So that put definitely like another, that just as an example, that put another element on our quote unquote win condition, right? We weren't just slaughtering everything. And I think even with, like we said, even with the assassination, like the one thing, you can also have capture. Just to throw in some more examples where you have to capture a certain character, right? So then you're not even trying to kill them; you just have to get to them and grab them, right? That's another one that's a mixed one. And the final one I wanted to bring up, and you guys can still bounce them at me, is I kind of brought it up at the very, very top before we even talked about the subject, was what I call is the no-win situation, where you're kind of just about mitigating damage or loss. And we've kind of touched on that here, but to really specify, like you were saying, with a really powerful enemy, it's not even about winning the combat. It's just about, this goes back, maybe it's time or maybe it's environmental. Like they just, they do it for long enough, or they do it where they get to a certain place, right? They're like, okay, these things are going to keep coming at you. You can't win. You just have to get to this, like basically the exit, right? Like you just have to get there. That's the win condition, is getting to the exit. So, these ones where
the
like
old
you
survive
can't
till
possibly...
dawn against the zombies trope.
Yeah, exactly. Or get to the airplane, right? Like you just have to get to the airplane and take off. Like, or like you said, there's an evacuation happening, right? You're protecting these people. You can't protect them all, and you can't protect them forever. It's just about protecting them as much as possible before the fire finally consumes the town. Are there any other ones you guys wanted to bring up?
No, I think there's probably a whole bunch of other. I mean, if you watch any popular media, you'll probably find a number of tropes that you can take advantage of. These are just a few, but there's probably plenty of tropes out there that you can pull into your game as
steal,
victory conditions.
Right?
Yeah.
We talk about steal, like go and steal from video games, go and steal from books, like
go and steal from any superhero movie out there. There's always different ones that don't just mean beating up everyone around the room. Yep.
Okay, so finally, let's go into our final kind of main component here. It's narrative.
Yeah,
and this one's
one.
Probably the most obscure, I think.
The episode's a long one.
James, James. Yeah, it was a long one because there's a lot to talk about. So, James, let's talk about this narrative. What are we talking about when we talk about narrative in fights?
So, often the most memorable parts of the game are not necessarily combat. Often the most memorable parts of the game are still how the story plays out. And so I guess this is just a little addition. I think the first three that we talked about is really how to create interesting combats. In my mind, there's another fourth one, which is how it's about not dropping the narrative component of the game just because it's a combat. And there's a couple of ways you can do it. There's lore exposition that can happen where people can reveal things about the world in combat, and that could be the type of armor that they're wearing. It could be something that someone says. It could be, the dying gasp of the mini boss that says, "You may have killed me, but you'll never kill the real boss." There could be things like that, and I guess for me, it's just not ignoring the fact that the story does not have to stop just because you're in a fight. I think too often I've been in games where there's a lot of plot exposition, there's lots of clues, there's lots of everything, and then it's like, oh, well, let's just stop that now and let's have a fight. It's about incorporating the narrative elements of what your story is trying to tell you into the fights. I think that's an important part, so that there are things that the players learn while the combat is going on. And it does allow, and it allows role play as well. You can talk to these enemies as they go. They can talk to you. There is the opportunity for discussion while you're shooting people in terms of these combats, particularly in combats that go for significant amounts of time and that involve significant waves of mooks. You can reveal the plot as you go. I think it's just an extra addition that I think creates another element of interest as a combat unveils.
Well, and I think also it can also be that through this narrative, through the conversations that are happening in combat, that the combat's going to end. You discover there's an opportunity that this bad person that you thought was bad all along isn't, right? That's a good trope.
Yep.
And you only discover that while you're cutting through minions and then go, oh, well, these guys weren't all that bad anyway. But so I actually had a convention game I run where the players are, again, post-apocalyptic, and there's a kind of a missile silo that's about to launch a missile that came back to life. And the AI, they get into a combat with the AI ultimately, or the minions of the AI. And then they realize the AI just doesn't know what it's doing. And they talk it down so that it doesn't launch this missile, and killing it would not maybe have even solved the problem. But that was part of the overall kind of combat as it was going on at the rounds level, as opposed to just purely at the exposition, pure role-playing level.
Yeah. This is really interesting, and I love your guys' points on this, and I also think that you can. Because, you should always inject narrative, and some of the easier, like when we're talking about random encounters now, I think there's a cool opportunity here that you can almost create some narrative, maybe that you already been thinking before, and you don't even have to know what you're going to do with it. I mean, I was just watching this show by the producers of Lost, and if you guys ever watched Lost, I mean, they just threw everything at
and they had no idea where it was going either, right?
Yeah, they didn't know where it was going. But you can kind of don't do it to that level, but you can kind of do this. Like, maybe during your fight, you're like, and all of a sudden they're like, over the sky, there's this hologram of a scorpion eating its own tail. Not even a snake, like a scorpion. And like, you might even not even know what that means at that moment, right? But then later on, you're like, oh, I'm gonna like reintroduce that little like symbol back into the plot, so that, because then the players will have that combat and they'll be like, what was that hologram about, And they'll be like, what is that going to add something? Like, just even that little bit of just something like that of a mystery or like a clue or something weird will intrigue them. And then you can tie that back into the story later. And on the inverse, if we're talking about kind of random encounters, or maybe when I say random encounters, I don't always just mean that like you're rolling on travel table. Maybe it's something that they got into a fight that you weren't expecting to have at that moment. You can also put Easter eggs in that maybe you were thinking of putting in through, later on through an exploration side. You might maybe steal one of those and put that in as an Easter egg into the combat. I think, James, you were kind of talking about that, where you can have like, maybe later on they were going to find a body, right, with like a note or with like a symbol on the emblem that would lead them to this gang. But then you can have this fight that you weren't expecting. They could have like that same symbol on the buttons of their uniforms or something. Like, you can kind of add in Easter eggs that you were thinking ahead of time into a fight to kind of just add that other element. So yeah, I think
absolutely,
James, it's a really good point. Yeah, go on.
And I again, I'm coming from in my modern games of Pulp Cthulhu, for example, the enemies talk all the time, and so I had an assassination at a mosque where some cultists were trying to take out a guy, and they're talking to the guy as they're trying to shoot him. You know what I mean? It's like, we've come for you because you did this. We, prepare to die because you've betrayed us. And it gives exposition to the group, and it gives them a reason to both protect the guy that's about to be assassinated, and it allows for some level of dialogue, which I think is really, really important. Yeah. And it changes the nature of a combat to, it's your turn, roll some dice. You get that interactivity and that interplay as you go, and I love it for spicing stuff up.
All right. Well, final thoughts, Carl?
I think my final thought is we broke this down into kind of 4 categories, but they all work together as a whole. And you can pick a little spice from one, a little spice from another, a little spice, but just make sure that it all kind of still makes sense as you do it, so that the players feel like it's cohesive, even though you're just trying to do a little bit of something special for them.
James?
My final thought is we could probably talk for another hour on this.
Yes,
but,
we definitely could.
But yeah, it's try to think outside the box. Try and do something a little bit different. And honestly, if as a storyteller you're excited by an idea of any of ideas that you've heard here, try something different. Just try it and see what happens, because I'm sure that your players will love you for it. Yeah,
and I'm pretty much in line with you guys, and I really agree with you, Carl, about, a lot of these are cohesive, like we've talked about, but I think it's also, don't be afraid, like I said at the very top, like to pick one or two out of these, even if it's a random encounter, because to me, those are the ones that, while I understand, I like using them at times, and I understand that, they really do kind of breathe some more depth to the world or width to the world, because it's not always just about the, the one linear thing, the quest that you're on. But it is good to have, a mix in the combats and make them feel different between them. Because I think, to me, as a player, that's what kind of, that redundancy and that sameness is what really kind of drags you down and makes it not as fun. It's interesting to have those things to react to kind of challenge you. So, yeah, I think it's easy. It is easy to kind of pick one or two of these and just kind of bring in, even if you don't have time to prep.
And so, and as you're fighting your boss, and he takes his sword and he takes it from his right hand and puts it into his left hand.
I would love to see that. I would love to see where the boss, because I don't think that's a really funny thing that you bring that up, Carl, because I don't think I've ever seen that in a game where it's like the boss was and you see that in media all the time. You see that in Western. You see that in anime. I would love to have a boss who was specifically nerfing themselves, so the players thought they were doing really well, and then like you said, the left hand.
This is not my final form.
They take off like anime, like they take off a weighted vest, weights they were holding on, and they're like way stronger, or whatever. They like drink something that like, I was actually had poison. I don't know. There could be a lot of fun things there, but that's a good final thing to kind of bring back to the name of the episode, right?
Yep. So hey, thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope you got something out of it. Remember to drop by masteringtherpg.com to learn about our other projects and contact us and support us. Email gamemaster@masteringtherpg.com if you have questions, need advice, have some cool stuff found, just like today, that you want to share with us that we may not have heard of. Or if you want Eric just to adjudicate some differences of opinion. We still are waiting for that. We're still waiting for that. You can also catch us on Twitter at masteringtherpg. If you like the show, give us some positive reviews. Just let us know. I mean, really, I mentioned the email, but just send us an email. Let us know if you're hearing it and you're listening to it, and where you're listening to it, where you're hearing it. That'd be great too. So, once again, I'm Carl with Eric and James. So say goodbye, guys.
Goodbye, guys.
Happy gaming.